I love basically just what I've talked about, how it can represent such a broad piece of history on top of just the physical thing, how it represents a whole story, from a letter requesting an essay, for Washington writing back and saying it's disappeared, from the inscription from Nellie about Martha, and to it being found all of these years later. I just think that itself is very cool about this.
Welcome to The Secrets of Washington's Archives. In celebration of the Washington Presidential Library's 10th anniversary, we're bringing you inside the vault at the Mars Rare Books and Manuscripts Room at Mount Vernon, to show you the books owned by George Washington and his family and the secrets they might hold inside. George Washington was a big consumer of periodicals, and he not only bought them for himself, but he bought them to share with his families and friends. Today, we're going to look at the Bee and Literary Weekly Intelligencer, a periodical that George Washington supported since its earliest days. Here to talk to us today about this fascinating periodical is Samantha Snyder, research librarian at the Washington Presidential Library. Sam is in charge of a lot of the research requests that we get here. She manages the fellowship program, and she's just an invaluable resource when it comes to the books and manuscripts held in this room. So thank you so much, Samantha, for joining us today.
Of course. This specific book represents such an interesting kind of it goes far beyond just the physical book itself. This is one really good example of just how much of a story one book can hold. I just think this is one of the coolest books in our collection.
This is, of course, a periodical that James Anderson, the creator, really intended to be used by people working in agriculture and business, who he saw as being sometimes excluded from the intellectual or cultural sphere, but who he thought needed to join those conversations.
In our collection, we have an exchange, we have a letter from George Washington to a woman that is referencing the bee. So by that, she had been asking him for an essay in the bee. So that shows that not only is it agriculturalists and industrialists, but it's women too who are consuming this information and reading these magazines. The woman's name was Elizabeth Powell, she was an incredibly important Philadelphian. She was very politically connected, very intellectual. She was very close with George Washington. She had written him asking for a specific essay that was within the bee. And so we have a letter back from George Washington to her quoting that specific essay, saying he can't find it. He's checked all of his volumes of the bee, and because the set is broken, he could not figure out where it was, and so he unfortunately could not give it to her. And so he says he's checked the indices of his sets of the bee, which actually, when you look at those, that lists out the different essays and poems and things like that. And sure enough, strictures on the Court of the Press is in Volume 7, which has mysteriously disappeared.
Well, where is Volume 7 today?
Well, it is currently sitting right in front of us. So I only wish I could travel back in time and hand this over to Elizabeth Powell and say, here is that essay. But what ended up happening, we think, is that Martha Washington might have just taken it off the shelf and handed it to Eleanor Parke Custis Lewis, who was her granddaughter and Washington's step-granddaughter, but very, very close to her, because we have an inscription from Nellie that says it was given to her by her grandmama, or something along those lines, and it magically disappeared after that. 100 years later, it shows up in a trunk.
In a trunk of other books, actually, that belonged to Washington, that had been passed down to Nellie.
Yes.
So lost and found, an amazing story. But I think, you bring up a really good point, too, about, George and Martha are sharing. George is sharing this with Elizabeth Powell. Martha's sharing it with Nellie. Mm-hmm. These are books that aren't just read by one person, right? They're kind of read by the family and the community as well.
These people, men and women, not only George Washington and Elizabeth Powell, but there's many other examples of this intellectual exchange of physical materials.
If you want to learn more about George Washington's support of the press and his influence on the bee in particular, as well as the bee's miraculous return to Mount Vernon, be sure to check out the podcast companion to this video series, also called The Secrets of Washington's Archives, available wherever you download your favorite podcasts.